Gina Welsh talks about this a lot when she was coming up with this idea that the internet is a character,
Yep.
in the show. This social media, the internet, this was all very new back in 2014. Like we had Twitter, we had social media back then, but it was still quite new. And this idea of going viral, this idea that like an audio tape or a story could just kind of take over the monoculture, take over the world. That was all new in 2014. Now we're kind of used to it, but it goes back to this through line that I always had as a writer. And when I was doing the podcast and the show, is like the through line really is there had been scandals around Donald Sterling for years. Why was this one different? Why was this one the one that took him down?
And she is an executive producer of FX series Clipped, which is available now on Hulu. We have the pleasure in welcoming Ramona Shelburne onto Hoopsology.
How's it going?
Good. Thanks for coming on to the show. Really appreciate it. Before we jump into the Sterling affairs and Clipped, we have a tradition on our podcast since we dive into everything about basketball culture. I want to ask you, you can take it any way you want it. What is your first basketball memory or favorite basketball memory?
Well, I grew up in LA during the Showtime Lakers, so it's definitely watching Magic and Kareem and all those guys. My aunt used to get tickets every once in a while to go to the Forum, and so I guess my first memory is probably being a little kid going to a Laker game, going to the Forum Club. She would get invited, it was just through her work or something. So going to the and we had like no idea what we were doing in there. We were just little kids. And watching the Lakers at the Forum. That's pretty formative early memory there.
So I want to shift to your podcast. I think it's fantastic. I've listened to it twice, most recently just in preparation for Clip. I think it's an awesome piece of journalism. Can you tell me with that podcast series, because I think it delves into just the 80s in particular of the NBA, and I think it's good for young fans to listen to. Can you kind of just go into just the planning and what went into just telling that story, specifically the NBA in the 80s, and also just the dynamics of Los Angeles as well between the Clippers and the Lakers?
Yeah. So, it helps that I grew up here, right? Like I lived this. And so I knew a lot of this stuff just from living in LA. I think I describe it in the podcast. Like, I don't remember anybody not liking the Clippers. They were just the Clippers compared to the Lakers, right? Like the Lakers were, the Showtime Lakers with Magic and Kareem and Michael Cooper, Byron Scott, and the Clippers. Like they had a couple of decent teams in there. They had like, at one point Norm Nixon was on the team and all that. But I think Norm Nixon, right? Ron Harper, right? Larry Brown was the coach. Like those are some decent Clipper teams in there. But I just kind of understand these two franchises from having grown up in LA. And I think a lot of when I covered the story in 2014 of how Sterling was ousted, a lot of what I came to understand on a deeper level was how we got here. Like how did it go 30 years of Donald Sterling behaving this way, and a lot of players and people feeling like he had these kind of ideas or treating people this way, but nothing ever happened. And so I remember, just at one point somebody told me like, that Donald Sterling helped Jerry Buss buy the Lakers. And I was like, what, really? And then I did a little deeper dive into that idea that he helped him buy the Lakers, and it was 100% true. And it was so true that, but there's even more to the story, which is that Donald used to go to the Forum Club early on and get a taste of that, that Showtime life, right? That glamorous Hollywood Showtime feeling that they had there. And that's what sort of helped him he was like one of Jerry Buss's friends. And that's what helped him, want to be an owner himself. And the more I started to understand these two guys, there was a lot of similarities between Dr. Buss, who used to own the Lakers, and Donald Sterling. Both grew up poor, Donald Sterling in East LA, Jerry Buss in Wyoming. And they both sort of were self-made men. And, in a different industry first, and then in real estate, in LA real estate in the 70s, when, if you know LA I mean, I was born in 79, so I only know this anecdotally. But it was LA in 70, there was a credit crisis and it was really hard to buy anything. So if you had cash on hand and you could buy real estate, if you were able to like get into the market, you did really well. And both these guys were able to do that because they had money from other businesses. And it's like their stories have this very similar trajectory, and they both end up buying NBA teams, and yet one of them runs them like Jerry Buss ran the Lakers, and then the other runs it like Donald Sterling ran the Clippers. And so I just felt when I was doing the podcast, like, how do you tell the story of the Sterling affairs? How do you tell the story of why this particular scandal is what brought Donald Sterling down, and who this guy was and who this franchise was? You can't tell that story without telling the origin story of who he was and where the Clippers fit into the basketball landscape and the civic landscape in Los Angeles.
So, can you walk our audience through the process of taking your podcast and then it being turned into a mini series on FX in terms of audio medium to a visual medium? What was that like? You got the proposal of that, and then what were your thoughts in terms of how you wanted the project to be portrayed as the finished product?
So, when I did the podcast, it was pretty quickly afterwards I started getting a lot of calls from Hollywood producers, people who listen to the podcast. And the podcasts nowadays are a lot of them get optioned and adapted because you've already done a lot of the work, right? You've already done a lot of the storytelling and the research, and you've already crafted a story in a narrative way that lends itself very well to scripted series. And I think the podcast came out in August, and pretty quick. I think I was in New York doing press for the podcast when I got a call from Nina Jacobson, and she's the lead producer at Color Force, which is the people who did People versus OJ and the murder of Gianni Versace. And I knew they made great television, and I knew they would do a good job adapting it. And it was, I had several other people who I talked to at the time, but I felt like once Nina called and was interested, I was like, yeah, we're gonna steer it there, because I just in my mind it was like, this is what they do. Like this, I always saw this as a story where you have event casting, you have who's gonna play Doc Rivers, who's gonna play Donald Sterling, who's gonna, right? And these guys at Color Force, these producers are they're sort of, I don't know if you want to call them the original. They've always been, stories ripped from the headlines or adapted from real life. But these guys have made some of the most successful limited series in recent memory. And I just felt like they would do a good job with it if they were interested. And they were, and I was, and so I met with them, I don't know, 5-6 times. We had a lot of meetings where I told them, just in general, they talked about their vision and how they would adapt it. I gave them some ideas and notes. My producer on the podcast, Julia Lowry Henderson, came to a couple of those meetings in LA. I think it was all pretty much done in September of that year. So like literally a month after the podcast comes out, we decided to make the show, and it was maybe by October is when they officially optioned it. So it was a pretty quick process. And then after that, I mean, this is literally 2019. So it took 5 years from that point to turn into a TV show. Some of that is because of COVID, right? There was just like things took longer to make. But they just went, and what they do as a producer, I think they spent a lot of time trying to find a writer. They went out to a lot of different writers that they knew. I met with 4 or 5 writers. I talked on the phone with 4 or 5 writers. And we picked Gina Welsh, who was an amazing writer and showrunner for this show. And by the time Gina came on board, it definitely was COVID times, because I remember going. All we all did was go for walks back then, right? So I was going on walks around my neighborhood talking to Gina for hours, giving her perspective on a lot of the characters as she was trying to find the story, giving her background, and then all through 2020 and part of 21, early part of 21, she was writing a pilot. And she wrote the pilot herself. I got sent a couple of drafts of it and stuff, but it was all her writing it. And then once they decided they really liked the pilot and they liked her vision for the show, that's when they decided to move to series. and that's when the rest of it gets going. You know, they had to hire a writer's room. They had to they had to script out the six episodes, 5 more episodes total. I kind of sat back. I remember in 2021 the Clippers were in the playoffs, and she brought the whole writers room to a Clipper playoff game. It was during that year where you were able to go to games but in limited numbers.
Yeah.
And the Clippers went to the Western Conference Finals, but she brought the writers room to the playoffs, and like she went and just trying to get as much authenticity as she could, just going to games and understanding that world. And so all of 2020 2021 is really just the script stage. It's really just the all of that. And then once they had all the scripts, then that's when they went out to actors. And I would they would kind of tell me who they were thinking about or who they'd gone out to, who said yes, who said no. And that was kind of a fun stage, right? Seeing people the imagination go wild with that stage. But I think they shot it all mostly, I'm trying to say, like 2023. Most of it was shot during that. Like, I mostly got told what was happening, right? Like at some point they had asked me, I set up a lot of interviews for them with like real people involved. So they would have, just for research and trying to get things right. But it was an interesting process to go through because, on the one, I have to, it was, for a lot of years, it was my story. And then at some point you hand it off to somebody else, to the Hollywood people and let them make it into a TV show. And it was kind of fun to sit back and just, do what they needed me to do as a producer on this and as a consultant, but also just kind of let them do their Hollywood magic.
A quick timeout from the interview to request a favor. If you love our interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video to hear more interviews from the world of basketball, featuring journalists from SB Nation, ESPN, CBS Sports, and The Athletic. Now, back to the interview. So one of the things that stood out to me was the Betrayal of V Stano. And I think prior to this series, I don't think her story was highlighted enough. And I think with what was shown on screen, you really get to saw her struggles, her motivations, the pain that she felt. And she was more of it, I'd say the media portrayed her as this one way. And I think through this series, you get to see her 360 degrees as a person. So what did she think of her portrayal and this kind of the series, centering somewhat around her as a character?
It's interesting with V because she was the one hole in the podcast, I felt. We tried many times to get a hold of her. We asked her lawyer many times would she participate, but she just, at the time she was really laying low. She was staying out of the spotlight. She didn't want to do any new interviews. And so we had to just go based off of, what we knew about her. And, I did a pretty deep dive, right? I mean, I called people she went to high school with. I called people that knew her. We called people around town that she interacted with. I knew her story, that she was adopting these foster kids at the time, and that was a lot of the background for who she was and what maybe some of her motivations for needing this sort of quote unquote better life. But she really had only done a couple of interviews in the 5 years since the whole scandal happened. And so we used those interviews that she had done on somebody else's podcast and, for here and there, just kind of explaining herself. But she didn't want to participate in our podcast. And so, you have to kind of, we wrote it the way we could write it, and we just did as much as we could. But I feel like in the show, they're able to breathe much more life into the character because you're not relying on her doing an interview with you. You can do a lot of research, and they did an unbelievable amount of research on her. Really deep dive into who she was and people around her and in her life. And I think when they did that, and then you write the character. So in the podcast, you're dependent on what people have said, right? Like what they've said publicly in a podcast or an interview. In the TV show, you can do a lot with research, because you can write the character. And I think she's, V and I have talked. We talked a couple months before the show came out. And she's exactly what I thought she was. I mean, before that, she wouldn't even talk to us, right? But I said, look, we should really at least just talk. If you don't want to talk for the podcast, that's okay. But let's get on the call. And we talked for a couple hours. I mean, it was a long long phone call. And I don't know what she thinks of the show. I haven't heard from her since it's come out, but I think it's I'm glad that we were able to humanize her character, because she really is such an interesting character in person, and I think she's so important to the show, because you have to think about, like, none of this happens without her. None of what happens to Donald Sterling, to the NBA, to the players, to all the characters involved happens without her making that tape being released, however it got released. And then, the funny things that she did, like this just straight, the visor and the roller skates and the turtle and like, oh, you can't make this stuff up. And so none of this happens without V Stano doing what she did. And so I'm glad they were able to give her a multi-dimensional character. And then also, quite frankly, Cleo, who plays Cleopatra Coleman, who plays her in the show, is just stunning. She's amazing as an actress, and I think she was so good that the character took on a bigger role because she was so good.
So I felt the same way about V Stiviano's about Doc Rivers, because as a sports fan, I think it's very easy just to paint Doc Rivers in one particular brush. But I think in this series, especially his conversations with LeVar Burton, using that as a device for Doc just to talk about the pain that he feels as just a black man, just as a man in general, just as a human, just going through this, just having a sounding board, and him being able to be vulnerable. I thought that was really powerful. Can you talk about that in terms of the portrayal of Lawrence Fishburne? Because I understand with Lawrence Fishburne that he's not a sports fan, and he came into it just very fresh, and yet I thought his portrayal of Doc was very humanizing as well. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting when they I think it was always Lawrence. Like, I don't remember them bringing up any other names for Doc. Like, we always thought Lawrence Fishburne, because you needed someone with gravitas. People forget how much gravitas and how good Doc Rivers was during that whole ordeal. He was such a leader. I mean, there was this, and I don't think you can, some stuff has happened since, right? He went on to coach the Sixers, and then he coached, now he's coaching Milwaukee, and there's all these things that happened after that kind of, brought him back down to earth as a basketball coach, or as a character in this world. But in 2014, like, he really was at a different level, as a coach and as a leader and a voice in this league. And so we had to find an actor who had that appropriate gravitas to carry that role. And I think it was always Lawrence. Like, I don't even remember any other name ever being brought up for that role. And it turned out he's really not a sports fan and doesn't really know much about it. But he and Doc actually did get together. I think they went to a barbecue at it was either at Lawrence's house or Doc's house. And they bonded in their own way. They connected. So he had a feel for who Doc was. But also, like, it's all in the writing. I mean, Gina has such an incredible script, and it's based off of interviews that I had done, but also interviews we did with a million other people who were part of that situation, is based off the podcast. And then I think with the conversation with LeVar, it's kind of a funny story. Rembert Brown actually tells this story. He's a producer on the show, producer and writer. They were looking for someone for Doc to be able to have as a confidant, right? They were, there were people that Doc talked to during that stage. I think he talked to his mom a lot. He talked to a couple of friends, a lot as somebody, but they wanted somebody who was like a celebrity who, who he could bond with. They would have this sort of like level that they would connect on as celebrities, but also in this very, I don't want the word that comes to mind is stripped down, but because that really is what it is, in a sauna, right? But it's, this vulnerable state, right? They're sort of where you can take off your armor that you have to go out into the world with, and just be talking to someone that you're a peer with. And they were really looking for the right person. And Rembert came up with this idea of LeVar Burton, like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, he's a safe person, right? He reading Rainbow and everything, but he also has like a lot more inside him, as a black man, and a lot to say. And then they brought it to Lawrence, and apparently Lawrence and LeVar are friends in real life, and they often talk about race in the sauna. Like, whoa, like it was really like that was really a life imitating art, or art imitating life, whatever you want to, whichever order you want to phrase it. And so it was very natural between those two. And a lot of the scenes and the dialogue, like Doc needed a confidant because he had to, keep his armor on for everybody else. But this was, I don't think they talked at the time. The Doc didn't really know LeVar or anything, but it's in Hollywood you need these types of devices to tell the story, and I think it was just a brilliant choice, and it's fun to watch unfold, and I think people will be excited to watch it all the way through in episode 6. So there's another couple of scenes there.
So, what has been the reaction so far to Clipped that have you received? Positive, negative? Has it what were your expectations before this series went out? Has it changed in terms of the feedback you have received so far?
Yeah, it's interesting. People watch things in different ways now. Like when I did the podcast, we just dropped. It was like in the middle of August, and there was nothing else going on, and we dropped the podcast, and everybody binged it right away. This they came out with in the middle of it's like literally the start of the NBA finals. And it was like, I think there's a sort of people are paying attention to basketball because it's the finals, but also I was covering the finals. And so some people watched it as it came out, and other people were like, I'm going to wait till after the finals to binge it. But the ones who watched it were like really into it. They were and what I've mostly got is a lot of people around town, a lot of people around LA watching it and talking, telling me about it. Or a lot of people are kind of disappointed there's only one more episode. There's only 6. They're like, why did you only make 6 episodes? Come on. So I take that as a good sign. I think the positive is everybody is just enthralled with the 4 main characters, with Doc and V Stiviano and Shelley and Donald. The acting there is like unbelievable. The characters are amazing. I think on the basketball side, you get a little like, we need more basketball, or that guy does he look enough like so and so? I mean, that's always going to happen, right? Because you can't, you can try to make somebody look exactly like that player, but that's for our purposes in the show. Like that wasn't. We just wanted good actors, and I think the actors that we cast, like, I mean, to me, Sheldon Bailey as DeAndre is incredible. I think J. Alphonse Nicholson as Chris Paul is really good. Like, I remember doing the table read and listening to Fonz, and I was like, God, he just sounds like Chris Paul. He just sounds like him. Oh my God. And so, I think some people want more basketball, like my basketball crew, or people who talk to you in that world, they want more of the games or more of the locker room stuff. But I'm like, there's 6 episodes. You got to make some choices, right? But I think it's, I think what's fun is seeing the disparate reactions, because it's really like, it is a basketball show, yes, but it's not too, it's really about this just really tangled, icky love triangle between these people.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a lot more depth, and especially for me being a hardcore sports fan, it was nice to see that the series showed different aspects of how the story came together. And I think it's an excellent compliment to your podcast series as well. I think they go hand in hand together. I want to ask you particularly about the Clippers now with building their new arena, and what is their perception in Los Angeles with just the fan base? And now, the Clippers don't have to share real estate with the Lakers. They have their own identity. The arena is supposed to be state-of-the-art, revolutionary, and just their own identity, like moving on from just kind of being within the Lakers shadow. What is that like now, as after all this happened? What is kind of the state of these two franchises? Are they like clearly separated, or is this still kind of like they're in this Lakers shadow? Like, what is their perception of the Clippers as an organization overall these days?
I think the new arena is really going to help. When they played at Crypto or Staples, whatever you want to call it, they always got like the worst choice in game times. They were third choice. It was the Lakers and the Kings, and then the Clippers. And also, like, when you're there, they had to cover up the banners which didn't go over well with anybody. I think they were, to me, the Clippers were, until they win, they're always going to be in the Lakers shadow. Even after they win, they'll probably still be in the Lakers shadow, because the Lakers have 17 banners, It doesn't help that they had this great team with Kawhi and Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, and they haven't won, right? Like there was this optimism with that group starting in 2019 that like, okay, this is going to be the team that breaks through. This is going to be the team that makes it. And they just haven't. They just, they keep getting hurt, things keep happening. And so there's this feeling like Steve Ballmer has done everything right. He's built this gleaming new arena. It's going to be great for them. He went out and made these huge free agency moves. But it's, the results haven't changed that much. And so I think over time it will. I think, you just keep doing everything the right way. Eventually it'll break through. But I feel bad for him because they really have done things very differently. Like Ballmer's been a great owner for 10 years. He's really empowered his people. He's staffed up the front office. He's built this in a new arena, great personal cost. I mean, it's gonna be great when it opens, but it's still a Laker town, and until the Clippers win, until they really steal the attention away, it's gonna be hard for them.
So in LA, a lot's going on, and I'd be remiss of it if I didn't ask you just kind of your overall thoughts of this with the Los Angeles Lakers, of them hiring JJ Redick, just in terms, and I want to get your opinion, being in the media too, just from a media perspective, because we've seen coaches move from just, being on different television networks to just coaching. Do you think that's a trend with JJ from the podcast space? Do you think that's going to be a trend with a lot of these athletes not having their own podcast, being able to show what they can do like JJ did with his really extensive basketball knowledge? Do you think that this will be a trend moving forward if he's successful? Or do you think if he's not, do you think that kind of will stop that trend as well? Like, what do you think? Is that this has more ramifications just separate from basketball?
I don't think it's about being a podcaster. I think it's about he's young and he comes across as like has fresh new ideas. I think there is a trend in the NBA towards hiring these young guys. I mean, look at Joe Mazzulla, look at Will Hardy. Like there's a bunch of young coaches in the league now that are hired in a lot of ways because franchises wanted to go quote young. They wanted to, and I think there's this idea that the game has changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years. It's gone. Everything is about, there's a lot of analytics that go into it. There's a lot of, like everybody kind of plays the way the Celtics do, which is like this, not everybody does, but they try to, which is, taking more threes than anybody, 5 out. Oklahoma City's doing that, right? Mark Dagnall just won Coach of the Year, playing that way with this young team. And so there's a sort of like fresh new perspective. And I guess I would compare it in football to like when Sean McVay had success. And then you just there was just this run on young coaches who have this sort of novel approach to football and the game and all that. And so I think there is definitely a trend in the NBA here, but I don't know if it's necessarily the podcast. Like
Gotcha.
JJ to me, was always going to be a head coach in this league. It was just a question of like, how long did he take? I think Steve Kerr is probably the right comp for him. He is, both they went into broadcasting or podcasting, and it's because they went through all this, they were able to they like people could just see who they were and how they understood the game, and your personality shines through. But I think it's with both of those guys, it was very, it's just a matter of time. Like the right job, the right time in their lives, and when did they make that leap? I'm still curious why JJ took this job. It's a tough job, He could have sat back and waited for a few other jobs that would be less high profile or less pressure, but I asked him that very directly, and he said, I just want to coach the Lakers. I was like, okay, take him at his word.
So he is from what I understand, this is just from a fan's point of view. I might be completely wrong, but he's feeling like a very direct person, very much no BS, just straight to the point. How do you think that will jive when, like, I'm sure it's inevitable where the Lakers, they lose 4 in a row. There's some kind of this stupid controversy that's not a real story with LeBron. He doesn't really I don't get the sense he has patience to really deal with that. How do you think he'll kind of deal with that different media environment, like you were saying, compared to if he was coaching a more low profile team?
I think it helps that he has been in the media environment, that he was a commentator on ESPN. He was on First Take. He debated these things, he kind of, he knows where a lot of this stuff comes from and why it happens and why, I think you understand it when you're on the inside. I can say that because I do these shows too. You understand why it's being talked about. A lot of times people will be like, why are you guys talking about this? I'm like, well, we have to talk about something. We have TV shows to do and fill, and we have to do what people are talking about in the league. So like they have viewership data. They understand what's going on. Like there's none of this is like a secret. And so JJ understands all of that because he's been on the inside. He understands where all this stuff comes from. There's not a, he's not going to try to be like, you guys shouldn't be talking about that, which is what a lot of people think. Like, well, wait until it's ready to be talked about. You're like, okay. No, it's going to be talked about whether you like it or not. So you might as well have your say on it. You're a relevant person. This is a relevant team. And so I think he understands that. I think it'll help him. Now, I'm sure he's going to get frustrated. I'm sure he's going to, there's going to be some growing pains in this job. I'm sure he doesn't know what he doesn't know, but this is, I find that at least with Steve Kerr, because he had that media background, he understands a lot of why people are asking him the questions or the stories that are coming up.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also with Steve Curry, I think he has a great sense of humor. I think that he's really good at playing that dynamic. I want to shift back to the clips real quick. And what came to mind is when watching it, the social media aspect. I thought that was really incredible in terms of whenever there was a kind of big story that happened within the miniseries, there is a social media consequence that came with that. And can you talk about that in terms of the factor of social media and playing that into the series? Because I don't think I've ever seen that in another TV show like it was in Clipped. I thought that was really interesting as well.
Gina Welsh talks about this a lot when she was coming up with this idea that the internet is a character, in the show. This social media, the internet, this was all very new back in 2014. Like we had Twitter, we had social media back then, but it was still quite new. And this idea of going viral, this idea that like an audio tape or a story could just kind of take over the monoculture, take over the world. That was all new in 2014. Now we're kind of used to it, but it goes back to this through line that I always had as a writer. And when I was doing the podcast and the show, is like the through line really is there had been scandals around Donald Sterling for years. Why was this one different? Why was this one the one that took him down? And to me, the answer was always, well, it was this mistress because she was willing to quote unquote bite the hand that feeds her. It was because she had a cell phone with voice memos, and because there was TMZ. Like at the time, previous mistresses, you saw that in episode 4. Yeah. There had been other mistresses. Some of them had tried blackmail as well. But it was, but they were not successful because they didn't have a smoking gun. They didn't have a tape like this. And there wasn't this option of just recording someone on your cell phone. You had to have a VHS, or you'd have to get them to sit for a deposition or whatever. And so I think that to me is why you had to capture the internet as a character, and show how everything would turn and move in this space really quickly.
So just from that time period, and social media has evolved and it became a bigger factor, I think, in everybody's lives, for better or for worse. In regards to owners now, just what's happened with Mark Cuban selling his team to another owner. What do you think of the kind of the state of owners in terms of what happened with the Donald Sterling just controversy? Do you think they're more aware? Like, has anything changed in terms of their demeanor? I know even with Matt Ishbia, he seems to be more out there. He seems to be more of a front-facing owner, as well as Steve Ballmer, as we mentioned before. Are there other owners that are more standoffish just based on what happened with Donald Sterling, or do you think nothing's really changed just in terms of how they are with the public and how they're perceived?
I think there's a lot more accountability in life, and there's a lot more recognition that something you say or do can have very big consequences outside of the realm that you're in. To me, at least, that's a really big difference. Like that's like, you can't underestimate how big a difference that is now. Like it used to be, you could kind of say things in private spaces and places and nothing would come of it. Now people are going to hear you, people are going to record you, people are going to, everything is seen. There's always a camera on you, whether you're at a game or whatever, and people are not afraid to speak up if they feel like you're doing something wrong. And so I think that to me is, it's not just owners, it's anybody in power, or anybody in the public spotlight. Like that's our world now. Like if I do an interview with an athlete at lunch, like I'm very aware that people might be recording us. I'm very aware. I try to sit in a corner and all that, but I'm always looking to see if somebody have their cell phone out. Are they taking pictures? Like it's just, there's a surveillance level that you just kind of have learned to live with, but it's awkward. It's a different level of surveillance feels like the right word. Like you're when are you in private? And is it okay to say things in private that you wouldn't want chopped up and all over the internet? I don't know. You see that, just everything we do in life nowadays, right? And so I think it, especially people like NBA owners who are, could have used to stay in the background a lot more, but it's not really an option anymore.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that in terms of yourself. You have to watch when people are videotaping you, and I think you're a very renowned journalist. That wasn't the case. I would say of other journalists. 10, 15 years ago. How's that changed journalism? Because you see a lot of this prominent figures that are within the journalism industry now. They're a part of the story, in which that's not what they got into the business originally from. But now just our society is kind of forced that hand nowadays. What is that dynamic like? Has that affected just kind of how you approach your job and your enjoyment of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed things. Like I wish, I saw this on the internet the other day. It was like Adrian Wojnarowski and I were talking, and I remember the story we were reporting. It was something, we're outside of crypto.com, and some fan came up to both of us and like wanted to take a picture. And we're always like, yeah, sure, that's fine, we'll take a picture. But it was like later on I found some like YouTube video of like him recording us talking from afar, and then like recording his approach to us and the whole and I was like, whoa, that was weird. Like, and this was like a sensitive story. I remember when it came out, like I think it was, we were reporting on LeBron and the Warriors, like the Warriors trying to trade for LeBron, and it was like, well, I mean, I guess he couldn't hear what we were saying, but like maybe, I mean, if you're close enough, you probably could have. I mean, that's weird, right? Like you're talking to a colleague, and I guess, I suppose we're in public, but there was no one else around. It was just somebody approaching us, and I was like, whoa, like I did not even see you coming, and you were recording us the whole time. That was weird. It's just the world we live in now. Like, or if I'm doing an interview with somebody and I have a story that's coming out, like, we showed this in episode 5 of Clipped, right, where Barbara Walters does the interview in some like weird place in New York, and she goes, well, this is my hideout, because if I did it at a studio, my competitors would be all over this. I'm like, I get that, I totally get that. Like nowadays, if I sit with a famous NBA player or whatever, it used to just be like, oh, let's get coffee, let's get lunch someplace. And like now I have to pick like a totally out of the way restaurant. Like, a couple years ago, I went and had lunch with Darvin Ham, and it was this like, we just went to this like, hole in the wall restaurant near the Lakers facility. And it was like, we started getting recognized by everyone. And I was like, and some guy wanted to take pictures. I'm like, oh, man, I'm just trying to have a conversation, like this is just a source reporter conversation. This is like coach, it was when he first got hired. And we finally kind of went off and sat, away from everyone, but it was like awkward. We had to be unfriendly. And then, why can't, it'd be nice if you could just meet people and just have a conversation and not worry that they're listening to everything you say or gonna put up videos on the internet about it. I mean, it's how you do your job. And so you have to have this level of awareness all the time. I don't want people to know I'm doing that interview. I'm going to write a story about it, and it's going to could take me 3 weeks, like I don't want everyone to know what I'm doing all the time. Wait till the story comes out. It's even competitively, like you don't want your competitors knowing this is what you're working on. Right. So it's, there's a different recognition all the time than we've ever had to have.
Final question for you. 30 for 30 ESPN, they have to say extensive library of just all kinds of different stories. since Clipped is very successful, I think just a great series. Is there anything from the 30 for 30 library, audio or video, do you think would make like a great story that could follow in Clipp's footsteps, you think?
That's interesting. I haven't thought about it because I don't know anybody else's. I mean, I've watched a lot of the 30 for 30s, haven't watched all of them. I know some other stories I'm working on to maybe either do another 30 for 30 on. But I gotta keep that to myself, right? Because it's a little proprietary at this point. But yeah, I think there's a lot. There's a lot from the sports world, and these kinds of stories are hot. I think there's a Aaron Hernandez story that's being developed into a show. I'm pretty sure about that they're filming it now. That obviously would make a really good limited series. I don't know. It kind of depends on Hollywood though, and whether or not this kind of content is what people are looking for, right? It's all so cyclical that on what studios are making and buying and developing and things like that. So, Winning Time. I really liked Winning Time. I was sad it got canceled.
Yeah.
That world and those characters could have gone on for quite a while. I think it was sort of a victim of the writer's strike, the writers and actors strike. It just kind of fell right into that hole there. But I hope there's more. I think sports has a lot of great drama. But it's obviously, dependent on what's going on in Hollywood too.
Yeah, absolutely. Ramona, appreciate the time. Thank you very, very much for just spending some time with our audience. Can you please let our viewers know where they can find you, either on social media, where they can find your work, any other projects you want our audience to know as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'm the same all over the place. I'm just at Ramona Shelburne on Instagram and at Ramona Shelburne on Twitter. And I try to tweet links to my work. If you can, we've been doing a companion podcast for the TV show called Let's Talk Clips. So each week we release a new podcast with the actors and producers involved. Last week was Jackie Weaver and Ed O'Neill talking about episode 5, which was really fun. And the final one is Gina Welsh and Rembert Brown, who are the showrunners. Gina's the showrunner and Rembert was a writer and producer. So it's a fun companion podcast if you get a chance to listen to it. It's on the 30 for 30 feed.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.